They dragged her off the plane like she was dangerous. 90 minutes later, with 162 lives spiraling out of control at 6,000 feet, one voice on the radio changed everything, a voice the airline had just humiliated. By the end of this story, you'll understand exactly who Phoenix really was. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Maya Reyes stood at gate 22B with her boarding pass folded into a small, neat square in her palm, the way she folded everything, maps, orders, letters she never sent. Around her, Terminal C buzzed with the ordinary noise of a Tuesday morning, rolling suitcases, a toddler crying somewhere near the coffee kiosk, an airline employee repeating boarding groups over a crackling intercom. Flight 714 to Seattle was already 40 minutes delayed, and the crowd's patience was fraying at the edges. Maya didn't fidget. She never did. She had learned a long time ago that stillness was its own kind of armor, that a body held quiet could pass through a room unnoticed while a body held tense invited questions. So she stood with her weight balanced evenly on both feet, her canvas duffel resting against her ankle, and she watched the gate the way she watched everything, carefully, without seeming to. She was 36, of average height, with black hair cut short and practical, and skin that had spent enough years under harsh desert sun to carry a permanent, weathered warmth. She wore a gray hoodie, jeans, and running shoes with the laces double knotted. Nothing about her said anything. That was rather the point. For 11 years, being forgettable had kept her alive. Nobody in the terminal knew that the quiet woman by the window had once flown F/A-18s off the deck of a carrier in the middle of the night with zero visibility and a wounded wingman limping home on one engine. Nobody knew that she had spent 14 months as the only woman in a classified strike wing whose missions were still sealed under a black budget line nobody in Congress could ask about by name. Nobody knew that in certain rooms with maps on the walls and coffee that had gone cold hours ago, her call sign still carried weight long after she'd hung up her flight suit. Phoenix. She hadn't heard anyone say it out loud in almost 2 years. She liked it that way. Today she was simply trying to get to Seattle, where her younger brother Danny was getting married in 9 days and needed his older sister there for the final round of decisions no groom-to-be should have to make alone, florists, seating charts, a best man giving a speech that was, by all early drafts, entirely too long. It was a small, ordinary trip, the kind of trip normal people took without a second thought, and Maya wanted, more than almost anything, to be a normal person for 9 days. The gate agent's voice cut through the noise again, tighter this time, more clipped. Ladies and gentlemen, we are significantly overbooked on this flight. We're going to need volunteers to take a later departure. If you're interested in a travel voucher, please see the desk. Nobody moved. Overbooked flights bred a particular kind of collective stubbornness, everyone assumed someone else would be the one to give in. The agent, a young man with a name tag reading Derek, began scrolling through something on his screen, his brow furrowing. He picked up the desk phone, spoke quietly for a moment, hung up, and then looked out at the crowd with an expression Maya recognized instantly. It was the look of someone who had just been handed an unpleasant task and was bracing to perform it. Maya Reyes, he called out. Could you come to the desk, please? Heads turned. Maya felt the brief, familiar prickle of attention and ignored it. She stepped forward, duffel over her shoulder, and approached the counter with the same even gait she used for everything. That's me, she said. Derek didn't quite meet her eyes. Ma'am, I'm sorry, there's an issue with your ticket. We're going to need you to take a later flight. I checked in 6 hours ago, Maya said. I have a confirmed seat. 14C. I understand, but there's a flag on your reservation. Security review. Derek glanced past her, and Maya followed his gaze to a uniformed officer standing near the jet bridge, arms crossed, watching. It happens sometimes with certain travel histories. I just need you to step aside so we can sort it out. Maya kept her voice level, the voice she'd used in 100 debriefs and a handful of interrogation rooms where she'd been the one asking the questions. What travel history? Derek hesitated, then read from his screen in a flat, apologetic monotone. Multiple entries and exits from Jordan, Qatar, Djibouti. Over the past several years. Our system flags patterns like that for manual review, and given current threat advisories, we're not able to clear it in time for this departure. The words landed in the crowded gate area like a stone dropped into still water. Maya felt, rather than saw, the ripple move outward, a woman nearby pulling her purse closer, a man glancing up from his phone with sudden interest, a mother angling her stroller a few inches away, as if distance itself were protective. In their eyes, in the space of 4 sentences, Maya had gone from woman waiting for a flight to woman who might be a problem. She understood, with a bitterness that had gone dull and familiar over the years, exactly what was happening. Her security clearance was compartmentalized so deeply that not even her own mother knew what she had done in Djibouti, or why she'd spent 3 consecutive Christmases somewhere she couldn't name. The travel history that made her look suspicious to an algorithm was the same travel history that had made her, at various points, one of the most trusted pilots the United States military had ever put behind a control stick. The irony had a taste to it, metallic and old, like blood in the back of the throat. "I've flown through those countries on official orders," Maya said quietly. I am a veteran. That travel isn't what you think it is." "I believe you," Derek said, and he sounded like he meant it, which somehow made it worse. "But I don't have the authority to override the flag. My supervisor's on the phone with corporate security right now." "I'm sorry. I really am." A supervisor arrived a moment later, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a laminated badge that read Stan Collier, station manager, and the particular brand of tired impatience that came from managing other people's worst days for a living. He looked at Maya the way Derek had tried not to, with open, unsubtle suspicion. "Ms. Reyes," Stan said, "given the flags on your file, and the current elevated threat posture, we can't clear you for boarding today. We can rebook you for tomorrow after enhanced screening." "My brother is getting married in 9 days," Maya said, and hated how small it sounded next to the word threat. "I need this flight." "I understand this is frustrating," Stan said, in the tone of a man who did not, in fact, understand. "But I have a duty to every other passenger on that aircraft. I'm sure you can appreciate that." Maya could have argued. She had, in another life, argued her way into rooms that outranked colonels, had stood her ground against men who outweighed her by 100 pounds and outranked her by 2 full pay grades, and had won more of those exchanges than she'd lost. But she also knew, with the clear-eyed pragmatism of someone trained to recognize a battle that couldn't be won with words, that nothing she said here, not her rank, not her decorations, not the truth about who she really was, would move a man who had already decided what kind of person she was based on a list of countries on a screen. So she didn't argue. She picked up her duffel, nodded once, and let the officer near the jet bridge escort her, not roughly, but firmly, a hand hovering near her elbow without quite touching it, away from the gate and toward a small windowless office near the security checkpoint, where she was asked to wait while the review completed. Through the office's single narrow window, she watched Flight 714 push back from the gate 40 minutes later. She watched it taxi. She watched it lift off the runway and bank west, carrying 162 people toward Seattle, and carrying, in seat 14C, nobody at all. Left alone in the small office, Maya allowed herself, briefly, to feel the sting of it. Not the delays she could shrug off, the way she'd learned to shrug off missed meals and cancelled leave and every other small indignity the service had taught her to absorb without complaint. It was the specific shape of the insult that stayed with her, that the very thing which had once made her exceptional, the willingness to go where others wouldn't, to serve in places that never made the evening news, had been quietly rewritten, somewhere in a database she would never see, into a reason to be afraid of her. She thought of her first deployment, 25 years old and terrified in a way she never let show, flying night sorties off a carrier deck with a senior pilot named Whitfield in her ear, steady as a metronome, telling her exactly where to look and when to trust her instruments over her instincts. She thought of the mission over the Arabian Sea, the one she still didn't discuss, not even with Danny, not even with the therapist the Navy had quietly recommended after her separation, the one that had left a hairline scar along her collarbone and had given her, in the same stretch of exhausted, adrenaline-soaked hours, the call sign that colleagues half a world away still used when they wanted to invoke a particular kind of certainty. Ask Phoenix. Phoenix will know. None of that was in the database that had flagged her this morning. The database only saw stamps in a passport, dates that clustered around unstable regions, patterns that looked, to an algorithm built to be suspicious first and curious never, exactly like danger. She pulled her phone from her pocket and, out of habit more than hope, opened the flight tracker app to watch Flight 714's progress arc northward across the display, a small icon climbing steadily toward cruising altitude. She watched it for nearly 10 minutes, telling herself she was simply passing time, though some old, well-trained part of her mind, the part that had spent a career reading flight paths for anomalies, noted, almost without her permission, that the aircraft's climb rate looked slightly shallower than it should have. She was still watching when the icon on the screen blinked, stuttered, and reappeared with a small red exclamation mark beside it. 20 minutes after Flight 714 climbed out of view, Maya's phone buzzed with a news alert she almost didn't read. Breaking, Flight 714 reports emergency, requests immediate return. She was on her feet before she'd finished processing the words, moving toward the office door with the particular controlled speed of someone who had spent a career training her body to move fast without looking like it was moving fast. The officer outside the door, a younger man named Ortiz, startled as she came through. "Ma'am, you're supposed to wait. Turn on a television," Maya said. "Now." Something in her voice made him obey without argument. He found a monitor near the security checkpoint tuned to a local news feed, and within seconds the images told the story faster than words could, a graphic showing an aircraft icon over the Cascades, a Chiron reading multiple system failures, and a reporter's voice, thin with adrenaline, describing an engine fire, a loss of hydraulic pressure, and a flight crew struggling to maintain control. Maya's stomach dropped through the floor. 162 people. A crew she'd never met. An aircraft she'd never flown, tumbling toward a crisis that, from the graphics alone, she could already recognize the shape of, because she had lived inside that exact shape before, at night, over water, with far less margin for error than any commercial airliner would ever be designed to have. "I need a phone to air traffic control," she said. "Now." "Not a request." Ortiz blinked at her. "Ma'am, I don't have authority to." "Get me Stan Collier," Maya said. "Tell him Phoenix needs to talk to Seattle Center." The word meant nothing to Ortiz. But something in the way Maya said it, the flat certainty, the total absence of doubt, made him reach for his radio anyway. 6,000 feet over the Cascade foothills, Captain Elena Vasquez was fighting an airplane that no longer wanted to fly straight. Flight 714 had lost its right engine 11 minutes after takeoff, a catastrophic compressor failure that had also severed the primary hydraulic line running along the wing route. Within 90 seconds, the aircraft's flight control system had degraded to a manual reversion mode that no training simulator fully replicated, because no training simulator wanted pilots to believe an Airbus could feel this heavy, this stubborn, this much like fighting a wounded animal instead of flying a machine. "Seattle Center, Flight 714, we are declaring an emergency," Vasquez said, her voice tight with the effort of holding the yoke against a persistent right roll. "Engine 2 failure with fire indication, hydraulic system green and yellow both showing critical low pressure. We have partial flight control authority only. Requesting immediate vectors for return. Flight 714, Seattle Center copies emergency, turn left heading 270, descend and maintain 4,000, expect vectors for runway 16 right." Beside her, First Officer Tom Reyes, no relation to Maya, though the coincidence would strike Vasquez later as strange enough to remember, worked through the failure checklist with hands that had gone slick with sweat despite the cabin's cool recycled air. "Elena, we're losing the trim," he said. "Manual pitch trim isn't responding. I think we've lost the last of the yellow system." Vasquez felt the aircraft's nose begin to hunt, drifting up and down in shallow, uncommanded oscillations that no amount of muscle on the controls seemed able to fully tame. 22 years of flying, 11,000 hours, 2 children waiting for her at home, and she had never once felt an airplane behave like this, sluggish and skittish at once, as though the machine itself had forgotten how to trust its own instructions. Seattle Center, 714, we are having significant difficulty controlling pitch and roll. Flight controls severely degraded. We may need alternate procedures for landing. Do you have anyone who can advise on manual reversion approach technique for this aircraft type? There was a pause on the frequency, the particular kind of pause that told Vasquez, more clearly than any words could, that the controller on the other end didn't have a good answer. 714, Seattle Center, stand by. In the small windowless office at the airport, Maya listened to the radio traffic Ortiz had patched through on a borrowed handset, and felt 11 years of careful invisibility begin, deliberately, to unravel. She recognized the failure sequence before Vasquez had finished describing it. Dual hydraulic loss with partial flight control authority was a nightmare scenario in any aircraft, commercial or military, but she had trained for something structurally similar in a program so classified its official name still didn't appear in any unclassified document: emergency recovery of battle-damaged aircraft with compromised control surfaces, using manual trim, differential thrust, and precise energy management to keep a wounded jet flyable long enough to get it on the ground. She had done it for real exactly once, over the Arabian Sea, in a jet with half its tail shot away and a wingman's voice in her ear telling her she wasn't going to make it. She had made it. "Get me Seattle Center," she told Ortiz. "Direct line. Not a relay. Now." Stan Collier arrived at the office at that moment, red-faced from jogging, having apparently seen the same news alert on his own phone. "What is going on?" "Your flight is in trouble and I can help," Maya said, cutting through him with a tone he had no ready response to. "I need a direct line to air traffic control. I need it in the next 30 seconds, not after another round of your review process. You're not authorized to. I have flown aircraft with less control authority than that Airbus currently has, in combat, at night, and brought them home," Maya said. "You flagged me for a security review 2 hours ago because of where I've traveled. I am telling you now, that travel was combat deployment. I am a decorated Navy pilot with a classified specialty in emergency aircraft recovery, and there is 162 people on that airplane who don't have time for you to make another phone call to corporate." Something in her voice, not volume, but absolute conviction, finally reached him. Stan stared at her for a long beat, then grabbed the desk phone and began dialing airport operations with fingers that fumbled twice before finding the right numbers. 2 minutes later, Maya was patched directly into the frequency. "Seattle Center, this is," she paused, only for a fraction of a second, weighing 11 years of silence against 162 lives, and then said the word she hadn't spoken aloud since she'd left the service. "This is Phoenix. I have experience with degraded flight control emergency recovery. Patch me through to Flight 714. The controller's voice, when it came back, had changed. "Did you say, Phoenix?" "That's correct." "Copy, stand by." There was a pause, brief but electric, the sound of someone on the other end recognizing a name that clearly meant something far beyond the airport where Maya was standing. Then the frequency clicked open, and she heard, for the first time, the strained, controlled voice of Captain Elena Vasquez fighting to keep her airplane in the sky. "Station calling, go ahead." 714, this is Phoenix, Maya said, and the office around her seemed to fall utterly silent, Stan and Derek and Ortiz all staring at her as though she had transformed into someone else entirely, which, in a sense, she had. "I have background in manual flight control recovery for aircraft with severe hydraulic degradation. I want to walk you through this. What's your current pitch and roll authority?" "Minimal," Vasquez answered instantly, relief audible even through the strain in her voice. "We're fighting a persistent right roll and the nose keeps hunting up and down. Manual trim isn't responding on the yellow system." "Copy." "First thing, stop fighting the roll with full aileron input. You're overcorrecting, and it's feeding the oscillation. Use small, deliberate inputs and let the airplane settle between corrections. Think in terms of nudges, not corrections. Copy, small inputs. A pause, and then, audibly, the aircraft's motion easing, not smooth, not by any measure, but less violent. That's better. Go ahead, Phoenix. Good. Now, for the pitch oscillation, I want you to use differential engine thrust to help stabilize your nose attitude instead of relying on trim. Small throttle adjustments on your remaining engine, timed with the oscillation, not against it. You're going to feel like you're flying with your hands and your throttle both. That's exactly right. For the next several minutes, Maya talked Vasquez and Reyes through a technique that existed in no commercial training manual, a hybrid of military emergency procedure and raw instinct, refined over years of simulator work in one unforgettable night over open water. She spoke in short, precise sentences, the cadence of someone who had given hundreds of pre-mission briefings and knew that panic fed on ambiguity and starved on clarity. "Phoenix, we have the runway environment in sight," Vasquez reported, 12 long minutes later, her voice tighter now with the particular tension of a pilot closing in on the moment of truth. "Fire and rescue are staged. We are configuring for approach, but I don't have confidence in a standard landing configuration with what authority we have left." Copy. Don't configure standard. Given your control authority, I want you to bring it in faster than normal, higher energy, straighter approach, minimal configuration changes late in the approach. You're not going to grease this landing, Elena. You're going to fly it onto the runway firm, controlled, and fast, and let the length of the runway and your brakes do the rest. Reduce power to idle at 50 feet, don't try to flare for softness. Just fly it down. There was a pause, the pause of a captain weighing a stranger's voice against 22 years of everything she'd ever been taught about how landings were supposed to feel. "Copy, Phoenix," Vasquez said finally. "Firm and fast." "Understood." Behind Vasquez, in the cabin, Senior Flight Attendant Renata Ibarra was moving down the aisle with the practiced calm of someone who had run this exact briefing in training 100 times and hoped, every one of those times, never to run it for real. She called out brace positions in a voice that carried without shouting, checked seatbelts row by row, and reassured an elderly man near the emergency exit that yes, she would be right there beside him, yes, they were going to be fine, even though she could not, in that moment, have said with total honesty that she believed it. Behind her, a mother held her son's face between both hands and told him, quietly, that this was going to feel like a big bump, like the biggest bump on the biggest roller coaster he'd ever ridden, and that she would be holding his hand the entire time. The boy, 8 years old and solemn in the way only frightened children can be solemn, nodded and gripped her fingers hard enough to leave marks. In the cockpit, First Officer Reyes read out altitudes in a voice stripped of everything but function: 3,000, 2,500, gear down and locked, 3 green, while Vasquez's hands moved with a precision that belied the sweat soaking through the back of her uniform shirt. Maya's voice remained steady in her ear the entire time, a fixed point in a cockpit that no longer felt fixed to anything, and Vasquez found herself gripping that voice the way a diver grips a lifeline, trusting it not because she had any way to verify it but because, in the total absence of any better option, trust was the only thing left to spend. "You've got this," Maya said, and meant it with a certainty she hadn't allowed herself to feel about anything in a long time. "You have flown this airplane through the worst of it already. This is the easy part." It was not, in fact, the easy part. The final 90 seconds of Flight 714's approach were the longest 90 seconds of Elena Vasquez's career, the runway rushing up too fast, the nose still hunting despite the throttle corrections, First Officer Reyes calling out altitudes in a voice stripped bare of everything but focus. But Vasquez held the aircraft on the technique Maya had described, refusing the instinct to soften the touchdown, refusing to fight the airplane's nature, and at 412 feet above the threshold she said, quietly, to no one but herself, "Okay. Okay. Firm and fast." The wheels struck the runway hard enough to rattle the overhead bins, hard enough that 3 passengers would later describe it, almost affectionately, as the best landing they'd ever felt in their lives, because it meant they were still alive to feel it. Reverse thrust roared. Brakes locked and released, the aircraft shuddering down the runway's length in a controlled, ugly, magnificent deceleration that ended, finally, 400 feet short of the runway's edge, engine spooling down into silence. Phoenix, Vasquez's voice came back, thick with something that was not quite laughter and not quite tears. 714 is down. We're stopped. Everyone, a pause, the sound of the aircraft's PA system audible faintly behind her voice, cheers and sobs bleeding through the cockpit door. Everyone is okay. We're down safe. In the small windowless office at the terminal, Stan Collier sat down heavily in a chair he hadn't noticed until his knees gave out beneath him. Derek was crying, unashamed, his hand pressed over his mouth. Ortiz stared at Maya as though seeing her, actually seeing her, for the first time. Maya set the handset down on the desk with hands that, only now, had begun very slightly to shake. The next several hours passed in a blur that Maya would only partially remember afterward, a blur of federal officials arriving at the airport, of a shaken but composed Captain Vasquez insisting, in a hastily arranged phone call, that the woman who had guided them down deserved to be found and thanked personally, of reporters gathering outside the terminal asking about the mysterious voice on the radio who had identified herself only by a call sign nobody could explain. It was Colonel Grant Whitfield, Maya's former commanding officer, retired now, but apparently still just senior enough in certain circles to have been notified within the hour that his old wingman's call sign had surfaced on an open-air traffic control frequency, who called Stan Collier's office directly, 40 minutes after the landing, demanding in a voice that cut through every layer of airline bureaucracy like a blade through paper, "Get Phoenix back on the phone. Now." When Maya took the call, Whitfield's voice was rougher than she remembered, worn by years and cigarettes he'd sworn to quit twice, but unmistakably, achingly familiar. "Reyes," he said. "You want to explain to me how 11 years of radio silence ends with you talking a wounded Airbus onto a runway in the middle of a Tuesday?" "It's a long story, sir." "I've got time," Whitfield said. "And apparently, so does the airline that just spent the last 2 hours discovering exactly who they tried to keep off a plane." Stan Collier, standing nearby and clearly still processing the scale of what had happened, cleared his throat. "Ms. Reyes, Commander Reyes, I want to formally apologize. On behalf of the airline. What happened at the gate today was," he searched for a word adequate to the situation and failed to find one, "inexcusable. If we had known." "That's exactly the problem," Maya said, not unkindly, but without softening it either. "You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them fairly. You flagged me because of where I'd traveled, without ever asking why. If I hadn't been standing in this airport when that emergency happened, there would have been no one on the ground who could talk that crew through what they were facing. The system that kept me off that plane very nearly ensured there was no one available to help save it." Stan had no answer for that. Nobody in the room did. Word of what had happened moved through the airport, and then the airline, and then the wider industry, with the particular speed reserved for stories that people needed to tell each other in order to process them. Within the hour, airport operations had reviewed the recorded frequency and confirmed, to a stunned FAA liaison, that the guidance given during the emergency had used procedures that existed nowhere in any commercial training manual, procedures that, when a young controller finally ran the call sign through a database she technically didn't have clearance to access, matched a classified emergency recovery program whose existence she was not supposed to be able to confirm at all. She closed the window quickly, said nothing to her supervisor, and understood, in the particular quiet way that people in her line of work often did, that some things were better left exactly where they'd been found. Federal investigators arrived within the hour to begin the formal review that any emergency landing required, and Maya found herself, for the second time that day, in a small room answering questions, though this time the questions were about airspeed and trim inputs and control authority rather than travel history, and this time the men and women asking them looked at her with something closer to reverence than suspicion. She answered everything she was permitted to answer, declined, politely but firmly, to elaborate on the classified mission that had first taught her the technique, and by the time the interview ended, the senior investigator, a soft-spoken man named Alvarez who had spent 30 years picking through the wreckage of worse days than this one, shook her hand and told her, simply, that in 3 decades of this work he had rarely seen a save that clean. "You'll be hearing from people," Alvarez added, almost as an afterthought, gathering his papers. "Reporters. Officials. People who want a piece of this story. I'd get used to that, if I were you." "I don't want a piece of anything," Maya said. "I want my brother's wedding to go well and I want to go back to being nobody in particular." Alvarez smiled, tired and genuine. "In my experience, ma'am, that particular wish doesn't tend to get granted. But I hope it does for you." Captain Vasquez found Maya 3 hours later, in the crowded arrivals hall where surviving passengers were being reunited with waiting families in scenes of unrestrained relief, parents lifting children off the ground, strangers embracing strangers, a young man on his knees with his face in his hands, simply breathing. Vasquez was still partially in uniform, her jacket gone, sleeves rolled, exhaustion written into every line of her face, but her eyes were sharp and clear when they found Maya standing quietly near the edges of the celebration, watching rather than participating, the way she watched everything. "You're Phoenix," Vasquez said. It wasn't a question. "I'm Maya." "Maya Reyes," Vasquez repeated, testing the ordinariness of the name against the enormity of what had happened. 22 years of flying and I have never," she stopped, shook her head, tried again. "You talked us down like you'd flown that exact failure 100 times. "Once," Maya said quietly. "I flew it once, for real. That was enough to remember every detail." Vasquez studied her for a long moment, the plain hoodie, the double-knotted shoes, the stillness that gave away nothing. "They pulled you off my flight this morning." "They did. Why?" Maya considered several answers, the flagged travel history, the algorithm, the assumptions built into a system designed to treat unfamiliar patterns as danger rather than simply asking a question. In the end she chose the simplest version, because it was also the truest. "Because I didn't look like what they expected someone qualified to look like." Vasquez was quiet for a moment, absorbing that, and then she reached out and gripped Maya's hand, not a handshake exactly, something firmer and more grateful than that. 162 people are walking through that arrivals hall right now because of you. I don't care what any flag on any screen says. You are welcome on any flight I ever command, for the rest of my career, and I will say so to anyone who asks." Maya allowed herself, for the first time all day, something close to a smile. "I'd like that. Preferably in seat 14C. I've heard it's a good one." The story broke nationally by that evening, though the details remained frustratingly, deliberately incomplete, a mysterious voice on an air traffic control frequency, a call sign that meant something to exactly the kind of people who never spoke to reporters, an airline scrambling to explain how the same passenger it had removed from a flight for security reasons had, within the hour, become the reason that flight's passengers were alive. Cable news anchors speculated. Aviation bloggers dissected the recorded radio traffic frame by frame, marveling at the technique, unable to place its origin. A retired Air Force general appeared on a morning show and said, carefully, that he couldn't confirm anything but that the procedure described sounded like something out of a program most people have never heard of, and for good reason. Maya watched almost none of it. She had learned a long time ago that the version of a story told by people who weren't there rarely resembled the truth closely enough to be worth the time. She turned her phone to silent, ignored the 17 messages from numbers she didn't recognize, and sat instead with Captain Vasquez in a quiet corner of the terminal cafe, 2 coffees going cold between them, talking not about hydraulic systems or manual reversion technique but about small, human things, Vasquez's 2 children waiting for her at home, Maya's brother's wedding. The particular exhaustion that came after fear finally released its grip on a body that had been braced for the worst. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been standing in that airport," Vasquez said, turning her cup slowly on its saucer. "If they'd let you board like you were supposed to. You'd have been in seat 14C, and none of us would have known you existed until it was too late to matter. I try not to think about it that way, Maya said. Every version where I wasn't there ends badly. I'd rather focus on the one where I was. Vasquez studied her for a long moment. Does it bother you? That the reason you were on the ground to help is the same reason they treated you like a threat? Maya considered the question honestly, turning it over the way she turned over every hard question, without flinching from it. It bothers me more than I probably let on, she admitted. But I've spent a long time learning that the injustice and the outcome don't cancel each other out. What happened to me this morning was wrong. What I was able to do this afternoon doesn't erase that. Both things are true at the same time. I've made peace with carrying both. Maya's brother Danny called that evening, having seen her face, grainy, distant, half turned away from the cameras, on a national news broadcast that had, within hours, turned the mysterious Phoenix into a headline shared across every major outlet in the country. He didn't ask about the wedding. He didn't ask about the seating chart or the too long best man speech. He simply asked, in a voice thick with something between awe and fear, whether she was okay. I'm okay, Maya told him. I'll be there for the wedding. I promise. You don't have to promise, Danny said. You've clearly got a lot going on. I promised, Maya said. That still means something to me. She flew to Seattle 2 days later, on a different flight, with a different airline, in a seat that had been quietly upgraded without her asking, by staff who had clearly been briefed on exactly who was checking in. Nobody stopped her at the gate. Nobody looked twice at the pattern of countries in her travel history. She sat by the window, watched the ground fall away beneath her, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, something like peace. She did not think of herself as a hero. She had never thought of herself that way, not during 3 deployments, not during the mission over the Arabian Sea that had earned her the call sign in the first place, not now. She thought of herself, simply, as someone who had been ready, because readiness, she had learned a long time ago, was not something you announced. It was something you carried quietly, in worn shoes and a canvas duffel, until the moment the world needed it, whether or not the world had thought to ask. Somewhere over the Cascades, in an airport office 200 miles behind her, Stan Collier was rewriting a screening protocol that had, for years, mistaken unfamiliar travel for danger and overlooked, entirely, the possibility of expertise. It was a small, quiet correction, buried in policy documents nobody outside the industry would ever read. But Maya Reyes, Commander Reyes, callsign Phoenix, did not need the world to notice the correction to know that it mattered. She had spent a career doing the necessary thing without waiting for recognition. This, in the end, was no different. 162 people were home with their families tonight. Her brother was getting married in a week. And somewhere in the quiet, unremarkable rhythm of an ordinary life, that was enough.